Here is a photograph from March of 1942, not long after the Japanese arrived. So the Japanese Army, Unit 731, took over the operations of this institute. We can see the Dutch scientists, the Indonesian scientists, and Imperial Japanese Army officers armed with swords in the middle of the photograph. They're clearly in charge of this structure now, and not the Dutch colonialists.
What the members of Unit 731 did was to completely pervert these ideals of medicine and science.
These gruesome experiments were an affront to human dignity on all sorts of levels.
Around 1940, this new technology called tetanus toxoid allowed people to be protected from getting tetanus. Tetanus is a very important disease and threat to military forces. Troops in combat get tetanus. They're in muddy, dirty environments. The Japanese would have been very keen to produce a tetanus vaccine on Java because their access to supplies from Japan were almost non-existent. They knew that they could produce a tetanus toxoid vaccine, but it is challenging to prove it works. They needed an answer, and they needed it immediately. I first heard the name Mokhtar in 2006. I was in the office of my friend, Sankot Marzuki, who at the time was the director of the Eichmann Institute. Professor Mokhtar was a very significant figure in the science of the early 20th century. He was a scholar. He was already a doctor, trained as a physician, and he was a family man. The story at the time was that Mokhtar had murdered hundreds of his fellow Indonesians, Romusha, who were slave laborers to the Japanese. This seemed so implausible to me that I just started digging and digging and digging to try to see if I could learn what actually happened.
To me and to us, a lot of us, it's part of the history of science in Indonesia. Big story about the science in Indonesia. Started with Eichmann, Hreins, and then at the end, Mokhtar, the first Indonesian director of the institute.
In August of 1944, the Romusha transit camp at Klinder, outside of Jakarta, started falling en masse. And when the doctors arrived, they suspected a mass outbreak of tetanus because the clinical onset of tetanus is a very distinctive, horrifying presentation. And that toxin affects our nervous system in a way that causes us to contract, go into convulsion, and eventually lose our ability to control our muscles, so that a tetanus victim effectively slowly suffocates to death by being unable to breathe. Samples were sent to the Eichmann Institute in Mokhtar's laboratory. He performed some pathological tests on some of the patients, and what he found was these tissues did not contain tetanus bacteria, but they did contain tetanus toxin, which suggests that this was not, a natural outbreak. It was a deliberate poisoning. The Japanese, I think, at that point realized that this had just gotten out of their hands. Two doctors died under torture. After the second doctor died of horrific physical torture, they paraded his remains in front of Mokhtar. And it was not long after that that Mokhtar signed a confession. It seemed that Dr. Mokhtar was first beheaded, and then they drove a steamroller over his body and put the remains in a truck together with other bodies and buried them all in a mass grave somewhere in the swamps near the coast. This tree is on the edge of Ancol War Memorial Cemetery, the site of the execution of most of the people who are buried here. And when I stand next to that tree, I get emotional almost every time. I can see in my mind's eye that man being forced to his knees, and then a sword going through his neck. I get it. It gets me every time, and it won't leave me. The Japanese chose the Ramusha for this experiment for the simple reason that they were routinely immunizing them against legitimate infectious disease threats. They didn't mean to kill those Ramusha, but they did mean to blame it on Mokhtar. They took his legacy. They let everyone here believe that Mokhtar was not a national hero, but a murderer of fellow Indonesians. The injustice of that burns in my heart. Most Ramusha, they died in Japanese labor camps. That's where they met their end. Why do we not know about this? And the short answer is quite simple. The people who did this to them were not brought to justice. There was no justice sought. It's a horrific thing that happened here. And we have to remember them. We just have to.